So now I go to the presentation. This is the schedule of our webinar. As you can see at the end, there's the opportunity to ask questions and make comments. BEESPOKE is funded by the European Regional Development Fund of the European Union, with the overall aim to enhance and improve resources for pollinators. 17 partners from 7 North Sea countries collaborate since July 2019. This picture was taken in December at Naturalis in Leiden. Most partners were there. I think we missed there 2 or 3 partners. And I'll just give you a very short project overview. Why BEESPOKE? The project was developed to design bespoke seed mixes to improve pollination for economic benefits to farmers. Scientific literature points to diverse pollinators leading to better yields and quality, which in some instances has been shown to improve profits. The crop pollination across the EU is valued at 15 billion euros a year. Now there's a lack of uptake of wildflower sowing in agro-ecosystem. Why and how can we help to resolve this when the benefits are substantial for insect abundance and diversity, with knock-on effects for birds and higher food chain? There needs to be a freedom and opportunity for farmers to improve crop pollination and other secondary benefits. Projects identified the wider benefits of wildflower areas, but most importantly, it engaged directly with farmers and land managers to understand reason for the lack of uptake and provided tools for them to put into practice schemes which would deliver benefits to them and the environments, including supporting a wide range of diverse pollinators over many years. It's all about resilience. Now, it's impossible to give you a complete overview of the project because then there's too little time left over for the herb-rich grassland theme. So if you want to know more about the project, you can see on our website and social media. And later on, we will post the recording of this webinar on the YouTube channel. And now I'd like to give the floor to Johannes Leins from the Grünlandzentrum, Niedersachsen, Bremen. Okay.
Thank you, Jan-Willem. I will quickly share my screen.
Oh, no, that's all right. I'm just listening to a webinar, BEESPOKE webinar.
Okay. Maybe you could mute your microphone.
Yeah, please mute your microphone.
Oh, nice. I signed up one the other day about. I signed up for ages ago. And it's coming up. You'll find the music.
All right. I'm going to talk. So first of all, welcome and good afternoon from my side as well. I'm Johannes Leins from the Grünlandzentrum Niedersachsen, Bremen in Germany. And I'm going to talk about the benefits of biodiversity in general, but also in the context of grassland management. So just a brief general overview of biodiversity, which is divided into 3 main levels. So we have genetic diversity within species. So the difference between individuals in a species. We have diversity of distinct species, so differences between species. And then there's the diversity of ecosystems, so the biotope and the community that lives in the biotope. Species diversity is often used as synonym for biodiversity, which is not necessarily true. Showing here a really simple example from Jasmin Schreiber. So on the left-hand side here, you see a forest where 2 beetle species live, and on the right-hand side, a forest where 3 beetle species live. So normally you could say, okay, forest B is more diverse because there are 3 beetles, but 2 of these beetle species are very rare. So the forest A with 2 really abundant beetle species is considered more diverse. What does biodiversity offer to humanity? The World Economic Forum calculated in 2020 that there are $44 trillion of ecosystem services provided by nature, which comes down to approximately 50% of the global GDP. There are a long list of benefits. I just want to highlight some of them. The most obvious one we are looking at here today also is subsistence, so food production. It can also be protection and resilience of ecosystems. It's more easy to adapt with high biodiversity, and in agriculture, biodiversity can provide natural pest control. Also, on the right hand here, there's inspiration for innovation coming from nature. Also, the medicine or health sector benefits from biodiversity. And if we look at tourism or holidays, it's also nice to have a diverse nature, and also there's inspiration coming for culture from nature. The Global Assessment Report of 2019 summed this up in one sentence I find really nice. The diversity of nature maintains humanity's ability to choose alternatives in the face of uncertain future, which really sums it up quite nicely, I believe. If we look at the state of global biodiversity, at the moment there are around about 25% of animals and plants endangered, and even approximately 1 million species at the risk of extinction, many of them within a few decades, actually. If we look at this extinction rate, it's roughly 10 to 100 times higher than it was over the average of the last 10 billion years, which you can see here on the right-hand graphic. Looking at the regional effects for Germany, so the country I live in, there was a population decline of ground nesting birds of 60 to 80% within almost 30 years, or less than 30 years, meaning 300 million breeding pairs were lost in this period of time. Also, there was a decline of biomass and insects or flying insects in protected areas, and over 76% were lost in roughly 30 years. There are 5 main factors for this change in nature. For instance, which is important to hear today, land and sea use change, or especially land use change, the direct exploitation of natural resources. Climate change is in the media all the time. There's also pollution and over-fertilization, and the introduction of invasive species into ecosystems. If we look at what happened on the political scale, first of all, here on the right-hand side, the topic biodiversity was not much of a topic in science up till the 1990s, and then started quickly raising until today. In the 1990s, what started this was the Convention on Biological Diversity in Rio de Janeiro with the Earth Summit, where they decided that preservation of biological diversity should be a global focus. It should be sustainably used, and from the social perspective, there should be fair sharing of benefits coming from biodiversity. Then, almost 20 years, not much happened till the Nagoya Protocol was implemented. That was again an initiative for urgent preservation of biodiversity. And in the last year in Montreal, there was the Biodiversity Conference, where finally 4 long-term goals until 2050 were defined, and 23 action-oriented targets until 2030. Just quickly on the national level again for Germany, there's a national strategy on biodiversity implemented in 2007 in Germany, which is monitored regularly. The recent report is from 2019. And for the state I live in, Lower Saxony, there's something called the Lower Saxony Way, which has a focus on biodiversity preservation. Going to the actual biodiversity in grassland, which is the topic here today. The grasslands are species rich, especially meadows and pastures. Over 40% of German vascular plants are found in grasslands. And of the red-listed vascular plants, also approximately 40% are predominantly found in grasslands. The thing with grasslands is that without grassland use, most of the grasslands, there's scrub encroachment or even forestation. And if you look at the cow symbol here in the natural succession process, so if grassland management or use is happening, this process of encroachment or forestation is stopped. But conventional land use is often linked to species scarcity and low biodiversity. Which brings me to the final slide showing how grassland management can promote biodiversity, which is the topic here today. So on the left-hand side here, you see two species with seed mix that were used in BEESPOKE that allowed no or low yield loss for farmers. These seed mix were resisted climate fluctuation and were or are insect friendly, but there are also other management strategies that can be used. For instance, segregation or land sparing, where you have one part of a plot with intensive management, so a high yield, but there's a protected zone like grassland strips that can still be species rich. The other option is integration or land sharing, where you have a moderate livestock on the grassland, which allows yield and biodiversity at the same time, because with a moderate livestock, grazing is generally beneficial because there's a heterogeneous structure on these grasslands that is good for instance, ground nesting birds, or it allows light for seldom plants to come to the ground. And also talking about livestock, there's one topic that is associated with this, which is manure. Manure left on the grassland, it promotes insect development. There's a rough calculation that I found shown here. So one cow produces 1 ton of manure per month, and from this 1 ton of manure, roughly 100 kilo insects can develop, which can be the food again for vertebrates, roughly about 10 kilos of vertebrates. Yeah, and with this, I want to conclude my part of the talk and give over to my colleagues who will go into more detail with the grassland management strategies.
Well, thank you, Johannes. It's clear that action is needed. Arjen Strijkstra of Van Larenstein University of Applied Sciences. I give you the floor.
Okay, so now for something completely different, because what I'm going to talk about is a little bit more about the struggle to actually get a handle on what kind of herb richness do we need and what kind of insects do we need, and how can we measure that. So why I opted for the idea to talk about diversity, numbers and sizes. So beware, there are going to be some diversity, numbers and sizes. Of course, I've not done this alone, but also with other students and co-workers at the University of Van Larenstein in Leeuwarden. But to get a picture maybe to the problem of herb richness, I got a couple of photographs from a relatively old Frisian inhabitant, not me, and he lived through a lot of change in grass, where in different stages of his life he saw the loss of diversity and flower richness go towards more productive grasslands in the right lower corner, which he now sees as green with his grandchildren. So that's a lot of change, of course, and also in Friesland in particular, there's a lot of grassland where this change has taken place. So that makes it very urgent to do something about this type of habitat and the richness it can yield. So what we did was try to figure out the link between herb richness and insects, but then try to figure it out in a relatively easy way. Not lazy, but easy is always better if you can handle it. So we measured existing herb richness. Question: what does existing herb richness actually yield in terms of herb richness, and how does that work out for insects on the same spot? Do insects react to subtle differences in herb richness already? That's a very important question, I would say, because it's very difficult to not have a reduction in herb richness when you start pulling biomass from the fields. So how to get a picture fast and also relatively cheap of that, and also how can we see this in the also having meadow birds be able to live there. So what we did was try to figure out cheap ways, and one of the cheap ways is a pan trap. Pan trap, this is for yellow, white and blue color lovers, flower users and pollinators also. Another cheap way to measure is to use pitfall traps. It's of course another set of animals you track there. It's more soil surface related. So the soil surface users, which are on the move all the time, have a high risk of ending up in these traps of biologists like carnivores and top predators. Of course, that's quite nice because that says something about the width or the width of the ecosystem in itself. So a nice group. And sticky traps, they're awful to work with, but they are cheap, also quite handy, as we will see later on. Also, this is another group, of course, low-flying, yellow-loving insects, amongst which grass and herb eaters, but also carnivores and parasites and pollinators get stuck to these for us to see what biodiversity actually is. Our fields was a kind of search for getting a combination of intensively used fields and extensively used fields, or herb-rich fields, which were basically branded as herb-rich in the north of Friesland, where there's a lot of grassland and a lot of dairy going on. So quite some land use on that on the grasslands over there. So on May 7, 2022, I took a trip with a couple of biologists who wanted to find out what kind of were there living in these grasslands, which were more herb-rich or less herb-rich. And of course, those data yielded a hell of a lot of analysis, figures, etc. And I will show a little bit of that. So of course, there's a little bit of a difficulty how to quantify herb richness. There are several definitions which are floating by in the Netherlands, at least, like more than 20 herb species in a lot, or a relative cover of herbs of more than 20%. But I found that much insightful, a kind of a quality index which combines the cover and a quality measure of plants. And of course, you can calculate figures from that define that more than 2.5 is a reasonable level richness and more than 3.5 is okay. Then if we look at the data from this, so if you look at the very, very low, it's quite small, but the very low row, it's a Q index. You see that there are figures from 1.32 to the right, 1.51. And this is in 2 different places. So the first 4 are intensive fields and the other ones are herb-rich fields. And after that, there are 2 summations or averages actually per location with a standard error of mean next to it of firstly the situation, or no, sorry, not herb-rich, the intensive situation, and secondly the herb-rich situation, where you see that there are more grasses species and more herb species and more total species in the herb-rich situation, more relative cover of herbs, and the Q index is relatively higher, at least, in the intensive situation. So this seems to be a relatively good measure, although apparently a lot of these situations do not get to the quality requirements, which may have all kinds of different reasons. But this is the sequence you will see, and I will show the diversity data in the same sequence with the same coloration, and more green means more better. So this is of course related to some species. In the intensive species, you see the English raygrass as a king, very high percentages, the top layer, and also you see with the decrease the quality score, you see an increase in the English raygrass score. So that gives me some idea that we're doing the right thing if it works out this way. If you look at herbs, then you see all kinds of different herbs. It's a lot to be seen here, but you see that in the first 5 or 6 of the herb-rich locations, you see some clusters of plants with relatively high Q values. So that seems to be an okay way to look at these fields in terms of herb-rich quality. So what about then? How do they react? One would of course like to see that there are a hell of a lot of insects in the herb-rich situations as compared to the intensive situations, but that does not work out that way. So it's a scattered pattern with all kinds of families and species groups. I've split it up in all kinds of different ways, and I more or less end up with a similar picture that now and again you see that there are higher numbers in the herb-rich situation, and every now and again, more now than again, there's a higher number of diversity in the intensive fields. That accounts for the pan traps. For different ways, you can look at the number of orders, number of families, or within species group, the number of individuals or the number of species, or in a specific species group, I think the Syrphidae, so the hoverflies as a species group, you see similar things, that it's not so clear that diversity or numbers are higher in herb-rich as compared to the other intensive situation. So what about pitfall traps? Basically more of the same, if not worse. You can see that also these species occur also in quite high numbers and under intensive situations. How about sticky traps? Well, sticky traps is something completely different because it's relatively easy to handle in an automated way. And that's what we did. We have a pipeline of working where we scan these sticky traps and then try to figure out as fast as possible what is the size and what is the species. Of course, the species part is the holy not there yet, but the size part is quite intriguing. So with a very fast analysis, you can already get a good indication of numbers and sizes, which says something about the biomass that is available. And it seems to be going quite right if we have some lines which show that it's quite close to what we see by eye, what AI and these visual things are picking up in terms of biomass predictions. The nice thing with that is that you can try to in what kind of size classes these animals occur, of course, because these sizes are very important. Certainly for meadow birds, there is a size range which is quite important. It's the largest size between 4 and maybe 12 millimeters of size. So let's focus on that a little bit. And you see that here on these sticky traps, we get a lot more higher values, relatively high values under the herb-rich conditions than in the intensive conditions, as you can see on the right side, and that's in numbers. So if we go to the sizes and what these numbers and these lengths actually mean in terms of biomass, you can calculate biomass from length, then it is more or less a similar picture that these herb-rich situations actually yield more biomass in terms of milligrams. Also significantly so. Everything I've shown before, the differences were not significant between herb-rich and intensive fields, but now there are some significant differences if you analyze it quite badly with simple tests. So that in a little bit different way, and we try some more intricate testing, then we see that these size categories in terms of the biomass that it can yield, indeed there is this middle category of 7 to 10, 11 millimeters long, yields the highest biomass in these grassland fields. So the left panel, you see that there's a little bit of a difference between the reference and the herb-rich, where the herb-rich is a little bit higher, borderline significant, but the interaction between the two gets you into a good picture of what's happening. Like the biomass on the right-hand side, you see that the reference, the intensive fields, they indeed go from May, that's the situation in 1, to June and to August, to a somewhat higher level of biomass. But the herb-rich situation goes over that, and that is specifically so because the size categories between 7 and 10 are not under pressure under the herb-rich conditions, where probably mowing is a major factor in there to get that result. So in conclusion, I've given a lot of information on diversity, number and sizes in these practice situation. The herb-richness situations seem to be quite nice in using these Q values. You can see gradients in herb-richness, which makes sense. The pitfall traps had a lot of variation and a low amount of difference. I think that there the problem is that the variability is extremely high and we need higher numbers to actually get good results there. On the sticky traps, we have more individuals, and these numbers seem to be helping because the numbers appeared more related to the variation in herb-richness. So higher herb-rich situations got more numbers and also more biomass. And that biomass is nice in terms of the link between the herb richness to these larger insects, which are a food source for meadow birds. And the nice thing about that is that these length analyses and these connected biomass analyses on pitfall traps can be relatively fast and cheap via automatic visual analyses. So that concludes more or less what I wanted to say. I hope I have too much figures and still a little bit of a usable message.
Thank you, Arjen. A lot of figures, but very interesting indeed. Now I'd like to give the floor to Regine Albers from the University in Oldenburg.
Hi, so I want to present a bit about the BEESPOKE project part that we did in Germany. So we looked at intensively used grasslands and how much diversity we can achieve in those and how insects can potentially benefit from that. We did so on 25 hectares of grassland with 5 different farmers on different soil types. So why should we even try to diversify intensively used grassland? So there's a pool of studies that shows that species diversity can increase yields or stabilize yields. Weeds are suppressed and there's a reduced dependency on nitrogen fertilizers. And also, as we see is becoming more and more necessary, an improved drought tolerance. So with all of this, of course, there's not really something in there that's necessarily something linked to insects, but especially insect pollinators that deliver a very important ecosystem service are inseparably linked to grasslands because of the plant diversity that's historically been in there. So how can we help them with this thought of progress? So we wanted to take a look at how intensively used grasslands look right now, which is more like the picture on the left. This is mainly perennial ryegrass, and wanted to turn this into something like on the right. It can look a bit messy on the first glance, but there's actually much to discover in there. So our seed mixes, there were 5 of them, were developed with the idea of benefiting the farmer as well as insect pollinators. But this is not quite easy to develop because 5 cuts per year and a high nitrogen level in the field is a very extreme environment for most plants. So there are some grasses that thrive on it, but not a lot of other plants. So herbaceous is actually pretty tough to a pretty tough goal to achieve. So we had a control mix, which is just perennial ryegrass with white clover, and then increased the diversity with more varieties of that clover, then added some ripwood plantain, which is quite established already in a few countries that have a lot of grasslands like New Zealand. Then we added a few more legumes, for example, red clover. And then we have a mix where we further introduced a few grass species that are supposed to complement the ryegrass. Now let's dive into the results that we had over the past few years. So this is a graph showing the average legume content in the fields by coverage. From left to right, you can see the increasing diversity of the mixes and the 3 years of the study. And in most studies, there's recommendations to achieve a legume cover of about 30 to 60% because higher values would risk increased bloat with dairy cows, and that is not something that we want. So we can see that this is actually fitting quite well into the range proposed. And we can also see that it was pretty stable over the 3 years of study, which is really great because there's always a fear that something like red clover disappears after a couple of years, but this is not something that we saw. So with this slide, I want to show you how many flowers we can actually find in there because the flowers is what the pollinators can feed on. So from left to right, again, there's the increase in diversity in the mixes, and from top to bottom, it's the 3 study years. And if you look at the 2 left columns, you can see that there's mainly one species that is providing the flowers, which is white clover. And the further you go to the right, the more it widens into the different species. So there's less flowers provided by white clover and more just by this entire mix, which is great because different insects have different needs and preferences. And so with the same number of flowers, we can actually cover much more of an interest for the different species. But even though there's many flowers here over the year, we have to look at how we manage the fields, because this can be detrimental for the outcome. So this is just the amount of flowers that we had in the month of June in all 3 study years. So in the bars for 2020 and 2021, we have pretty high numbers, and they are quite nice. But for the last year, 2022, there was a total breakdown in numbers. And that was because we had really good circumstances actually last year for an early cut in those grasslands to make nice fodder. And the conditions stayed nice, so the second cut was early as well, and that totally destroyed the growth conditions for the clovers. So there was just no flower establishment before July. And this is really bad for the development, for example, of bumblebees. So our management is still something that has very great impact and on how this grasslands turn out to be interesting for insects. So what is it that diverse pollinator communities actually need? Of course, there's food all season long, and that's what we get with the clovers, but also a variety of different food sources, as we saw in the diagram for the different flowers in the different mixes. They need places to nest and places to overwinter. So the last 2 is something that we cannot provide in those grasslands because the intensity of the use is just too high. There's machinery going over it. So we also need some places to the sides, like the borders of the meadows, where they can have some nice nesting grounds. So with these conditions, where we mainly provide food and not so much the other conditions that they need, we can mostly benefit the generalistic insects. So it is not really a place for a lot of red list species, but studies do say that all that is done is valuable, because even the common species are in decline and certainly need some help and more insect-friendly landscapes. So every flower that can benefit a generalist is a good flower in the landscape. Now let's take a look at how many insects were actually there. So we looked at the 2 most important pollinator groups that we do have in Central Europe, which is wild bees, including bumblebees, that is a graph on the left, and hoverflies, which is a graph to the right. Now, looking at the wild bee graph, we can see that the amount of bees doubled from the first to the second year and remained that high in the 3rd study year, which is incredible because in the 2nd study year, we had a really bad spring for wild bees. It was very wet, it was rather cold, and that is horrible conditions. But still, they increased very much because they had really good conditions in the year before. So there were a lot of bumblebee queens starting nests, and they just thrived on the field. So even though the conditions were not great, we absolutely had this group profiting from it. So the hoverflies are a bit more indifferent, but what you can see here is that the 3 bars to the right of every year group is higher than the 2 bars to the left with the lesser diversity. So why is that? We can see that in the next graph. So this is a correlation between the number of flowers and the number of insects found in the field. On the left graph with the bees, you can see that it increases together. More flowers means more bees. With the hoverflies, we cannot see it. It's just more or less horizontal lines. But when we just look at the plantain flowers, which is only present in the last 3 mixes, we see an increase, which is also significant. So this is the kind of flower that we need to benefit hoverflies. So this is something that we can literally see what is helping. Now, we also looked at the fodder quality of our grasslands. Since we are providing for dairy cows, we need a very high fodder quality. And this is the average for the yields in over the entire season, so from May to September cuts. Left, we have the net energy lactation rate, and to the right, the protein content. And the red lines indicate the values that we want to achieve, and they were top for all of our different mixes. So we can see that we can make the cows happy with these mixes, and we do not have a decrease in fodder quality with more diversity in intensively used grasslands. Plus, we can also say that with more clovers and protein in the food, cows tend to have a higher intake of dry matter. We did not study it ourselves here, but it is widely proven that this happens. So we do have greater protein intake and greater food intake just by feeding this kind of silage or fresh grass material. And we can also see it in the behavior of the cows on the field. So they are all looking very curious to the meadow over the ditch, which is our bespoke mixes. The grass is greener on the other side, I guess. So how can we achieve even more? So we can, of course, test more plant species if they can be added to this kind of mixes. But as I said before, it's rather tough conditions. So there's a limited pool of plant species we can add. Herb varieties can be bred that might provide the right flowers or might be adapted to the conditions of the field better. And we can adapt the mowing pattern and timing to insects as much as it is possible to do that without harming the fodder quality we need for the dairy cows. And of course, we can provide high value landscape elements around the fields that can be used for nesting. So in conclusion, a high amount of flowers do increase insect pollinator abundances. More flowers in those intensively used grasslands is definitely a great step towards more insect-friendly landscapes. Legume fodder can decrease costs because there's more protein in there, and we do not have to buy it from outside, and it can further reduce use of nitrogen fertilizers, and it increases intake, and the fodder quality is still high no matter the diversity in those fields. And with this, I want to finish my talk and hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you. Quite interesting. And I see a lot of material for next programs. And like the reduction of nitrogen, that could be a new program, because that's quite a hot topic in Europe at the moment. Dirk Albach, also from the University of Oldenburg, last but not least, and then we will have the Q&A session. Dirk, please.
Yeah. We still have the screen of Regine.
Ah.
Sorry, here you go.
All right. Okay. Hope you can see my screen now.
Perfect.
Good. So I want to continue with the project that Regine introduced you to. And since we now learned also from Arjen and Johannes that biodiversity is really threatened and we need to do something, and we can actually do quite a lot on the grass. And I want to convince you that with management, you can still earn your money as farmers with more intensive, with more species-rich grasslands. So Johannes already introduced you to the idea of land sharing versus land sparing. The one, land sparing, you have some intensive land use and some which is just left over for the biodiversity, and land sharing where you try to combine those. And the picture that Johannes showed you was one in which the agricultural yield is certainly lower than intensively used grassland. But what we were trying in the BEESPOKE project is coming from the agricultural high yield grassland, see how far we can go up with species density without really compromising the agricultural yield. Further, we want to also see how we can lead to climate resilience while keeping the agricultural yield high. Plus, we want to do it as insect friendly as possible to provide enough resources also that insect communities will be healthy in the countryside. And of course, this needs to be cost efficient. So we still want farmers to earn the money they need to survive on their country, on their land. So these are the 5 mixes that Regine also already introduced you to. The ones with just ryegrass, Lolium perenne, and Trifolium repens, and then the addition of plantago, addition of more legumes, addition of more grass species in the 5th mix. So how about the yield? We did measure yield in 3 of the 5 mixes. The control with just the ryegrass and the 1 clover variety, the legume diversity with several clover varieties, plantain, and several legume species, and the 1 with all species together. And you can see there is a slight increase in biomass in our experiment, but it's only slight. And theory suggested that there would be an even higher increase, but we consider this due to the fact that we only analyzed very few species. We didn't measure the increase from 1 species, just ryegrass, to ryegrass and clover, but we have here the increase from 2 species on the left to about 10 species on the right. And probably with even more species, this increase in yield would be higher. But even more important probably is that we did not use seed mix in which the different species and cultivars are adapted to each other. And the study by Suppinger Dingley in 2014 suggested that this biomass increase with biodiversity is something that develops over time. So if we would have stood our fields for even longer and analyzed it longer, then we may even see a larger increase in yield over time. So one concern with the biodiverse seed mix was that we get more open soils, as you can see here in the pictures. But when we analyze this, we did not really find this pattern. As you can see here, there is more open soil in the first year, 2020, and only very little open soil in the second year. And this is, of course, due to the establishment phase in which the plants first need to establish. But it demonstrates the necessity to have some fast establishing annual species in the mix to increase the yield and to lower the open soil percentage. But what you also see is that the orange mix, the grass diversity mix, here on the right-hand side in each year, has more open soil than the other mixes. And this is due to Dactylus glomerata being in this mix. And these are growing more clumpy, and they produce more open soil. But according to our results, this is not a big problem, as you can see here. This is a picture where you see the border between the legume diversity on the left and the grass diversity on the right. And they are really good stands. The open soil is not any concern here. So one idea of these high diversity mixes is also that they suppress weeds. And you can see that here on the left side is a mean weed coverage. So the amount of weeds, which is fairly low in the first years, then increases in the second year, but it drops down considerable in the third year. If you look at the percentage, this is really not a lot compared to what you see in normal grasslands. And it's also the mean number of invading species on the right, which has a trend to decrease. So over time, more and more invading species and weed species are shaded out by the grass diversity and by the different mixes. So one thing that Regine already mentioned is climate. And this was a major interest also for our partners from the seed company to see how the different grasslands are behaving in different situations with regards to temperature and with regards to precipitation. And what you can see on the left in this bluish green, there you see the precipitation. And you can see that in 2021, the precipitation was much higher than in 2022. The temperature on the right was comparable. So it was just a comparison of really the amount of precipitation in the fields that we could analyze. And indeed, you can see quite a lot of brown grass in 2022, but what you can also see is that the drought did not affect the clovers, neither the white clover nor the red clover, and also not the plantain, which all three kept on growing even in the driest part of the summer. And even, which is nicely shown here, the grass next to the clover was more greenish than the one further away. So there was also some facilitation and some help from the clovers to the grass to keep on growing and to remain green during the drought season. We did see this also in the food values. This is the same graph that Regine showed you before, but I want to highlight two different aspects here. First, the net energy, lactation, and protein content was lower generally in the drier to 2022 than in the wetter 2021. This is what you see when comparing the yellow boxes with the orange boxes, and the yellow boxes are always lower. But if you compare the yellow boxes and the orange boxes for the grass diversity compared to the other mixes, you see that the difference, especially in the protein content, but also in the others, is much larger for lesser diverse mixes than for the grassland diversity mix. For the grassland diversity mix, the values of 2021 and 2022 are about the same. So we have, with the grass diversity as expected, some way to counter the effect of drought on the drought-sensitive Lolium perennial on the ryegrass. So how about cost efficiency? Yes, the diverse seed mixes cost about 20% more, but the yield is comparable to even better in dry years. So as a farmer, you're really protecting yourself from hazards from the dry seasons. Then the use of nitrogen fixing legumes allow the reduction in fertilizer use. This was not measured directly, but the information by the farmers, what they used as fertilizer could amount to approximately 20% reduction in fertilizer use. Fourth, the diverse fields are more resistant to weeds, so the farmers also used less herbicides in these fields. Fifth, the diversity benefits the beneficials. Remember that syrphid larvae feed on pests, and this is also something that is really important and helps the farmers use less pesticides on the fields and save money on that. So finally, there was no to very minor adaptations of management necessary. So you can use the same machines, you can use the same kind of silage for for the management of the fields, and no further costs are necessary for that. But of course, some adaptations to the management would be desirable if you want to do more for insects and biodiversity. And there are some recommendations that we will publish shortly on the BEESPOKE website regarding this. So keep updated on this. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Oh, thank you, Dirk. Quite interesting results. Thank you all for the presentations. And I wonder, are there any burning questions? Do you want to know more, or do you have a remark? You now have time to speak up. No? So I guess the story was very clear. Well, if there are no questions and remarks, then I would say, Hans Kootsma.
Yeah, sorry, I was away for a few minutes, so I didn't know if we could ask questions or not, but now was the time, I think.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Well, in most of the presentations I saw cutting grass and mowing was not very good for the insects in the most things. So is cows grazing in the fields? Has there been research on that, or is there research needed on that?
Dirk or Regine?
I mean, probably Johannes should add to that, but we see that more and more farmers, grassland farmers, are keeping their cows in the stables, and that's why we concentrated on mowing. But the cows on the field would certainly add by manure to the diversity of a field. So based on the biodiversity, I would recommend grazing, but this is just from the biodiversity side, and maybe Johannes can add based on other research at the Grassland Center to that.
No, I agree. Only if you talk about putting cows to grazing out on the field, it's only good for biodiversity if it's on a moderate scale. So it shouldn't be intensive grazing. Doesn't have a very good effect because it also destroys a lot of biodiversity. That's what I can add.
Okay, and then another question about manure or putting it on the fields. Is that better for biodiversity or not so good? Because, well, I really don't know. I think when there's manure on the lands, I think that there are coming a lot of insects to it because they can feed on it also. But is that so or not?
Those.
Of course, the farmers bring manure to the fields because they need the nitrogen in the fields. This can be reduced a bit with the bespoke mixes because of the legumes, because there's nitrogen fixing happening. So there is something like too much manure on the field, but it is certainly, well, it is valuable to reduce it a bit, but of course there's a lot of insects dependent on the kind manure and other kinds of cattle feces out in the landscape. So I would not ban it from anywhere. It has to go somewhere, and it's the more eco fertilizers, I would say.
Okay, thanks.
Anna Jansma.
Yeah, I also have a question. I was wondering, I don't know what the situation in Oldenburg is, but here in, especially in the northern part of the Netherlands, farmers are also sowing pasture herds. And what they see is that after 3 or 4 years, the amount of herbs in the vegetation is decreasing. So then they have to re-sow again. And on the other hand, you see that if you look at carbon sequestration, there is a lot of attention for permanent grasslands. How are you considering that? That on the one hand, you want to maintain permanent grassland, and for this kind of mixtures, you need to plow and re-sow again. How do you look at that?
Yeah, we had one study actually looking at intensively used grassland, permanent grassland next to our zone in grassland fields. And when you use intensively used permanent grassland, you have a decrease of flowers over time. And with regards to the flower number, it would be beneficial to re-sow grasslands from time to time. But I absolutely agree that with regards to CO2 sequestration, this is not what you really want. And there is no easy way of doing either, or there is a need for doing both in our countryside.
Yeah, I agree. It's also difficult. And what you see in other parts of the Netherlands, they have also a rotation with maize. So then they have 2 years those pasture herbs mixtures and then maize again. So you can also use it in rotation, but I think it depends on the area and if there is arable farming possible or not. But otherwise, you can also implement it in rotation. But in some grassland areas, which have heavy clay and are just wet grasslands, it's not suitable always. But in some regions, it fits well. So if you have a combination with arable farming, then I think we can.
Yeah, the rotation should definitely be longer than 2 years for these kind of pasture lands. So in Germany, we have these rules that if you keep grassland for 5 years, then it becomes permanent grass and you're not allowed to plow it again. So, but would be good to have these kind of pasture grasslands for at least 4 to 5 years then.
Okay, so that would be a recommendation if you're doing it in rotation, and at least for 4 or 5 years, then have the pasture herbs in it.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. And I got a question in the chat from Philip Griffith. From the insect point of view, when is the best time to harvest the grass? Silage or hay timing?
I would say it's necessary to have fields that are harvested at different times over the landscape, so that there are some that are harvested earlier and some that are harvested later. So when we're looking at this intensively used grassland, this is mainly produced to get really high quality fodder, and there's not much of a time frame, so you cannot really shift very much front or back date wise, because otherwise the quality of the fodder would decrease. So that's something to keep in mind. When it gets a little bit more extensive, and it does not really matter if there's a wee bit more of protein in there or not, then I would suggest that the first cut is rather early, actually, because the spring growth of grasses usually doesn't start. But after the first cut, that's when the white clover really starts, and it takes a little bit longer for the red clover and for the plantain, for the flowering to start. So I would say the first cut early, and then the later cuts if they're good. But it's usually a bit earlier than, for example, for areas protected for ground nesting birds. So for the first cut is usually better for them.
Okay. There were slight frozen moments in it, but I think the message was clear. Does it answer your question, Philip? I guess so. Are there any other questions or remarks?
Yeah, I have another question about native seeds. When you don't plow the land, then there are coming some native seeds who were already there into the land, and that would be better for insects, if I can believe people who studied a lot about insects and grasslands. Is that so?
Yes, indeed it is. We did a study with different white clover cultivars and native seeds, and indeed it seems like the domestication of white clover led to a reduction of the number of flowers for the benefit of more leaf biomass. And we saw that indeed the honeybees and bumblebees preferred the native white clover over the cultivated cultivars of white clover. Of course, for the farmers, I totally admit that these native white clovers have more cyanogenic compounds and less biomass, so they may not be as good for the farmers and for the cows as the cultivated one. And so it's another trade-off between biodiversity and farming.
Yeah, because when I see the new mixes, the seed mixes, they deliver a lot of mass and pretty good fodder for my cows, but well, they are not they're not native, and well, I don't know how good they are for insects, so maybe there's something to look at that. But
yeah, but there's simply not enough seeds of native species for grasslands available for just covering the needs of flower strips and public places, I guess. So it's some big market, these native seeds, and we'll see probably an increase, but at the moment it's difficult for farmers to use regional seeds.
great, thank you.
Then there was another chat question from Philip. Question of the back of cut timings. If we need protein, is the best provided from other sources to replace soybeans, etc.? Who would answer that?
Probably none of us, but I know that the German Institute for how's it called in English? For there's a German institute south in Quakenbrück in Lower Saxony, which is trying to get proteins out of grassland, and there is some projects on this. At the moment, I guess soybean is still the best resource for protein, but we will see some change in that in the future, I'm sure, with more efficient ways of extracting proteins from clover-rich grassland.
Yeah, I would like to add to that. So, of course, soy is a very efficient source of protein, but we saw over the last years that there can easily be lacks in the supply chain, like when there's just not the delivery coming from other countries because maybe some ships cannot go or some transportation doesn't happen, and suddenly we're there without the protein supply that we need. So a little bit more sustainability in the homegrown protein production would certainly be valuable, in my opinion.
Yeah, so in the Netherlands, we get mostly the advice to cut the grass in 4 weeks, every 4 weeks, every month, and that's the best quality for fodder. But I don't think 4 weeks is enough to raise insects or birds or anything what has to do with biodiversity. So I think that's that's not a good thing to put together, but I don't know.
You're absolutely right. I mean, we're constantly talking about trade-offs between biodiversity and farmers' yields.
Okay. I see no further questions. And we are already 11 minutes late, but that's no problem. So if there are no more questions or remarks, I would like to thank you, but also our partners for the topics and also for the questions and for listening to us. Please follow us, because we also will produce a magazine. We have already one magazine out, and there will be a second one at the end this month. I will show the address later on, but for now I would like to thank you, and this is probably the last webinar of Bespoke, and for sure we will go on in other projects, but if you want to be informed, please follow us on the webpage and on social media. So thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.